The smell of foreclosure is a distinct, nauseating mix of burnt coffee, cheap car air freshener, and cold mud. Arthur knew it the second the bank rep stepped out of his leased sedan, eyeing the dirt driveway like it might permanently infect his polished shoes. 30 days, the paper said. Graham Caldwell did not look like a grim reaper. He looked like a man who checked his heart rate on a smartwatch and complained about hotel thread counts. He stood in the center of Arthur's decaying barn, wrapped in a slate-gray wool overcoat that cost more than the rusted Ford tractor sitting 20 feet away. Caldwell tapped a plastic stylus against his tablet. The screen cast a sterile, bluish glow onto his face in the dim light of the barn. "I'm just doing the inventory, Mr. Pendleton," Caldwell said, his voice completely devoid of malice. That was the worst part. If the banker had been cruel, Arthur could have been angry. But Caldwell was merely bored. He was an undertaker cataloging a corpse. Arthur stood by the open double doors, letting the biting November wind chew at the back of his neck. He wore a canvas jacket stained with hydraulic fluid and dried cattle blood. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, fists clenched so tight his arthritic knuckles throbbed. "Inventory," Arthur repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You mean stripping the copper wire out of the walls?" "We prefer to call it asset realization," Caldwell murmured, not looking up. He walked past the workbench, wrinkling his nose at the smell of rancid cutting oil and generations of accumulated sawdust. He logged the drill press. He logged the oxyacetylene tanks. He walked over to the 1978 Ford tractor, noted the bald tires, and assigned it a number that Arthur knew was half its worth. Then, Caldwell walked toward the back corner of the barn. The roof had leaked there for the better part of a decade. The sunlight filtered down through the rot in the ceiling, illuminating a massive, lumpy shape covered by an old canvas tarp. The tarp was stiff, cemented into its folds by bat guano and decades of ambient dust. "What's under here?" Caldwell asked, hooking 2 fingers under the edge of the canvas. He pulled. The stiff fabric tore with a dry, ripping sound, kicking up a cloud of pulverized dirt that hung heavy in the damp air. Caldwell coughed, waving a manicured hand in front of his face. Arthur felt a sudden, irrational tightening in his chest. "Just leave it," he said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. Caldwell had already pulled the tarp back, revealing a rusted iron behemoth. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a monument that had been buried in a mudslide. 2 massive cast-iron flywheels, each 6 feet in diameter, flanked a central cylinder the size of a beer keg. Thick coats of dried grease, hay chaff, and flaky orange rust obscured whatever paint had once been there. "Good Lord," Caldwell muttered, wiping a smudge of dirt from his sleeve. "What is this? A locomotive?" "Stationary engine," Arthur said flatly. 1909. Miller Hart, twin flywheel. My grandfather used it to run a sawmill back when there were actually trees left in this county. Caldwell peered at it, unimpressed. He tapped the thick rim of one of the flywheels with his stylus. It made a dull, heavy thud. "Does it run?" Arthur let out a short, humorless breath. "Hasn't fired since 1982. Cylinder is probably seized solid. Magneto shot. It's just sitting." Caldwell nodded, already typing on his screen. "Right. Well, I'll mark it down for scrap weight. Cast iron is going for what? Maybe 9 cents a pound right now? Thing looks heavy. Couple $100 maybe." Scrap weight. The words hit Arthur harder than the foreclosure notice. The bank wasn't taking his farm. They were taking his family's bones and grinding them down to pennies to balance a ledger. He remembered the deafening rhythm of that engine. He remembered the smell of burning kerosene and the way the ground would shake for 30 yards in every direction when it ran. He remembered his grandfather standing next to it, wiping sweat from his brow, looking like a king beside a roaring iron beast. And this kid in a wool coat was going to sell it to a recycler to be melted down into rebar. Arthur looked at Caldwell, at the soft hands and the pristine shoes. He looked at the Miller Hart, a 4-ton block of dead iron. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly. "Yeah," Arthur rasped. "Scrap weight." Caldwell finished his tapping, locked the tablet, and offered a tight, practiced smile. "The bank will be in touch, Mr. Pendleton. 30 days. He walked out of the barn, his shoes crunching on the gravel, leaving Arthur alone in the dust. By day 3, the silence of the empty farm began to ring in Arthur's ears. He had sold off the last of the herd 2 weeks prior to cover the final mortgage payment, a desperate, bleeding neck attempt to stay afloat that had ultimately failed. Now, there was no lowing of cattle in the morning, no feed truck grinding up the hill, just the wind rattling the loose tin on the machine shed roof. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cold, canned vegetable soup. The foreclosure letter sat beside the bowl, its bold black print burning a hole in his peripheral vision. He hated the letter. He hated the silence. But mostly, he hated the memory of Caldwell tapping that massive flywheel with a plastic pen. He stood up, dumped the soup into the sink, and put on his heavy coat. When he reached the barn, the air inside was freezing, smelling of damp earth and old diesel. He walked directly to the back corner. He grabbed the torn canvas tarp and ripped it entirely off the Miller Hart engine, letting it drop to the dirt floor. It was ugly. Arthur had forgotten just how ugly it was. It was a crude, brutal piece of engineering built for a time before safety regulations or aesthetic design. It was just mass and leverage. He didn't formulate a plan. He didn't have a sudden, cinematic realization that fixing the engine would save the farm. He just knew he needed to hit something, to fight something that wouldn't talk back with legal jargon. He wanted to pry a victory from the jaws of this dying place, even if it was a meaningless one. Spite is a highly effective fuel. Arthur went to the workbench and gathered an armful of tools, a heavy ball-peen hammer, a set of thick box wrenches, a pry bar, a wire brush, and 3 cans of penetrating oil. He started with the cylinder head. The 4 massive nuts holding it in place were rusted tight, fused to the threaded studs by decades of moisture. Arthur soaked them in oil, the harsh, chemical smell of aerosol solvents cutting through the stale barn air. He waited an hour, drinking bitter thermos coffee, then fitted a wrench over the first nut. He pushed. Nothing. He leaned his entire body weight onto the wrench. The metal dug into his palms. His bad shoulder screamed in protest, a sharp stabbing ache that radiated down to his elbow. He stopped, panting, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Stubborn son of a bitch," he muttered to the iron. He grabbed a 3-foot length of steel pipe, a cheater bar, slipped it over the handle of the wrench, and pulled. The tension built. The pipe bowed slightly. Arthur gritted his teeth, a vein pulsing in his neck. Crack. For a second, Arthur thought he had snapped the stud. He stumbled backward, his elbow slamming hard into a wooden support beam. He bit down on a curse, rubbing his arm, but when he looked closely, the nut had turned. A fraction of an inch of clean thread was visible. It took him 3 days just to get the cylinder head off. The work was not noble. It was grueling, dirty, and painful. He gouged his thumb on a sharp edge of rust, leaving a smear of bright red blood on the dull gray iron. He wrapped it in a greasy rag and kept working. He dug out the petrified remains of a mouse nest from the water hopper, gagging at the smell of ammonia and dried bones. When he finally pulled the heavy cast iron head away, the cylinder bore was revealed. It was dry, scored, and the piston was locked tight at the bottom of its stroke. It looked like a tomb. Arthur mixed a cocktail of transmission fluid and kerosene, poured it into the cylinder, and left it to soak. For a week, he came out every morning and every night, tapping the edges of the piston with a wooden block and a sledgehammer, trying to break the bond of rust. Thud, thud, thud. The hollow, metallic ringing became his daily prayer. During the second week, he moved to the ignition. The Miller Hart didn't use a spark plug. It used an igniter, a mechanical set of points inside the combustion chamber that snapped open to create a spark, driven by a trip mechanism on the side of the engine. He disassembled the delicate, grease-caked linkages, cleaning them with a wire brush and solvent until his hands were stained permanently black, the grime embedded deep in the cracks of his skin. He tested the old brass magneto. He spun its gear by hand while holding the output wire. A sharp, stinging jolt shot up his arm, making him drop the wire with a hiss. It hurt, but a tight, grim smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. There was fire left in it. On the 18th day, Arthur was standing by the flywheels with a pry bar jammed between the floorboards and the massive spokes. He heaved against it, his boots slipping in the dirt. He was exhausted. His back felt like it was strung with barbed wire. He was running out of time, money, and food. He let out a ragged breath, closed his eyes, and threw his weight against the bar one more time. A terrible grating screech echoed through the barn, metal dragging against metal. Arthur froze. He looked at the flywheels. They had rotated, maybe 2 inches. He jammed the bar in again and heaved. Another screech. The heavy iron wheel groaned, moving another few inches. The piston had broken free. Arthur dropped the pry bar. He leaned his forehead against the freezing cold iron of the water hopper, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently. He smelled the kerosene evaporating from the open cylinder. It smelled like blood and dirt. It smelled beautiful. The 27th day. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the dead fields in a thin layer of white. The temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees. Inside the barn, Arthur's breath was a constant, thick fog. He wore 2 flannel shirts beneath his heavy coat, and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. The Miller Hart was fully reassembled. Arthur had fabricated a new gasket for the cylinder head out of thick copper sheet. He had plumbed a temporary fuel line using a plastic jerry can of fresh kerosene and a funnel. He had greased the main bearings until the thick, amber sludge oozed from the brass cups. There was nothing left to do but try. Arthur stood beside the engine. The sheer size of it was intimidating. The flywheels towered over his waist. To start an engine this large by hand was not just difficult, it was incredibly dangerous. If it kicked back, the momentum of the heavy iron spokes could snap a man's arm like a dry twig. He went through the ritual his grandfather had taught him, a memory dragged up from a 40-year-old mental filing cabinet. He opened the compression release valve, a small lever that allowed the cylinder to vent pressure so the flywheels could be spun up to speed. He primed the mixer with a squirt of highly volatile ether. The sharp, medical smell of the starting fluid stung his nostrils, cutting through the cold. He stepped up to the left flywheel. He grabbed one of the thick, curved spokes with both hands. It was freezing, the cold biting straight through his leather work gloves. Arthur planted his boots. "All right, you heavy bastard," he whispered. He threw his weight backward, pulling the spoke. The wheel resisted, massive and inert, but then gave way. It turned. The gears meshed with a heavy, mechanical clack. He kept pulling, walking his hands back along the rim, pulling the next spoke, then the next. The massive flywheels began to rotate. The sound of the engine turning over was a deep, wet, sucking noise as the heavy piston drew air into the massive cylinder. Shoo, clack, shoo, clack. Arthur moved faster, his boots slipping on the frozen dirt. He was fighting 4,000 pounds of inertia. His lungs burned. His bad shoulder screamed, a hot knife twisting in the joint. He got the wheels spinning faster, a rhythmic, heavy momentum building. No. With his left hand, Arthur slammed the compression release lever shut. Immediately, the engine fought back. The piston slammed against the trapped air in the cylinder. The flywheels rapidly lost speed, groaning under the immense pressure. Arthur grabbed a spoke as it came over the top and threw his entire body weight downward, fighting the compression. The igniter tripped with a sharp snap. Nothing. A hiss of white vapor shot out of the exhaust pipe, carrying the smell of unburnt ether, and the flywheels shuddered to a halt, rocking back and forth. Arthur let go, staggering backward. He bent over, resting his hands on his knees, gasping for air. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cold air tore at his lungs. Failure. He looked at the machine. It just sat there, silent and dead. The banker's voice echoed in his head. Scrap weight. No, Arthur grunted. He stood up. He wasn't done. He marched back to the intake. He adjusted the brass needle valve on the fuel mixer, turning it exactly 1/16 of an inch richer. He grabbed the ether can, gave it another liberal squirt. He opened the compression release. He grabbed the spoke. He didn't think about his shoulder. He didn't think about the foreclosure. He poured every ounce of his remaining strength, every drop of his simmering, cynical rage into his arms. He hauled on the iron wheel. Shoo-oop, clack. Shoo-oop, clack. He got it moving faster this time. The heavy iron wheels were a blur in the dim light. He reached over, slammed the release valve shut, and threw his weight onto the spoke for the compression stroke. Snop. A deafening, concussive bang shattered the silence of the barn. A gout of orange flame shot 2 feet out of the rusted exhaust pipe. The heavy iron chassis physically jumped, the sheer violent force of the combustion shaking the timber floorboards. A thick cloud of jet-black smoke billowed up into the rafters, instantly filling the air with the choking, acrid stench of burning kerosene and decades-old carbon. The flywheels surged forward, carried by the explosive force. The exhaust valve clattered open. Then the intake valve sucked inward. The engine coasted for a second. Then the trip mechanism engaged again. Bang! Another violent explosion. The floor trembled beneath Arthur's boots. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating his shoulders. Clack, 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 bang. It was a hit-and-miss engine. It didn't roar like a modern motor. It fired, coasted until it lost RPM, and then fired again. The rhythm was terrifying and majestic. Clack, clack, clack. Bang. Every explosion sounded like a shotgun going off in a metal barrel. The mechanical violence of the exposed gears, the blur of the massive flywheels, the sheer concussive force of the exhaust, it was overwhelming. Arthur stumbled back, coughing as the thick, eye-watering exhaust smoke filled the space. He wiped a mixture of sweat and soot from his forehead, leaving a black smear across his face. He stood in the cold, dim barn, deafened by the rhythmic artillery fire of the Miller Hart. The machine was spewing smoke, vibrating so hard the wrenches on the workbench were rattling off onto the floor. It was chaotic. It was loud. It was magnificent. Arthur looked at the heavy, spinning iron. A slow, genuine smile cracked through the grime on his face. It wasn't dead, and it sure as hell wasn't scrap. Sound behaves strangely in the dead of winter. The frozen air is dense, acting less like a cushion and more like a solid pane of glass. It carries low-frequency vibrations across open fields with terrifying clarity. 4 miles down the county highway, Thomas Reed was driving a 3/4-ton pickup truck with the heater blasting and the driver's side window cracked. Reed was a man who made his living in the margins of other people's obsolescence. He wasn't a scrap dealer, but he operated in the same graveyards. He was a broker for industrial antiquities, hunting down steam tractors and pre-war iron for eccentric millionaires who wanted a piece of the American Rust Belt in their climate-controlled warehouses. He was smoking a cheap cigar, listening to the static of an AM radio, when he heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Reed frowned, rolling the window down another inch. The icy wind howled into the cab, but beneath the rush of air, the rhythm was unmistakable. Bang. It was a deep, concussive shockwave that rattled the loose change in his cup holder. Reed hit the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly on the icy blacktop before coming to a halt on the soft shoulder. He killed the engine. He killed the radio. He sat in the sudden, freezing silence of the cab and listened. Thud, 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 bang. Reed pulled the cigar from his teeth. That wasn't a tractor. It wasn't a modern diesel, and it certainly wasn't a standard, single-cylinder farm engine. The delay between the exhaust strokes was too long, the displacement too massive. The sheer volume of the combustion echoing off the dormant hillsides spoke of cast-iron walls 2 inches thick and a piston the size of a tree stump. Reed reached for the 4-wheel drive lever, slammed it into high, and pulled back onto the road, following the noise. Back in the barn, Arthur was fighting a losing battle against the heat. The Miller Hart was running, but it was angry. The water in the massive cast-iron cooling hopper had begun to boil, sending thick plumes of white steam into the rafters to mix with the black exhaust smoke. The engine vibrated so violently that the dirt floor beneath it was beginning to liquefy, turning the hardpack into a trembling layer of oily mud. Arthur stood 3 feet away, his chest heaving, his left arm hanging limp at his side. His shoulder felt like it had been packed with crushed glass, but he couldn't look away. The massive flywheels were a terrifying blur of momentum. The exposed rocker arm clattered with a frantic, metallic urgency. He had to oil the main bearings. If he didn't, the friction would melt the soft Babbitt metal inside the journals, and the engine would tear itself apart. He grabbed a long-spouted brass oil can from the bench. He stepped toward the spinning iron. It was like stepping onto a highway median. The sheer wind generated by the flywheels whipped at his coat. He hovered the brass spout over the small glass drip-feed cup on the main bearing, timing his movements to the violent shaking of the machine. He squeezed the trigger. A drop of amber oil fell, missing the cup entirely and hitting the spinning crankshaft. It instantly vaporized into a cloud of blue smoke that stung his eyes. "Damn it!" Arthur rasped. wiping tears and soot from his face with a filthy sleeve. He steadied his hand, bracing his hip against a wooden support beam, and tried again. He was so focused on the drip cup that he didn't hear the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. He didn't hear the heavy barn door squeal open wider. The engine noise drowned out everything. It wasn't until a shadow fell across the dirt floor that Arthur turned, instinctively raising the heavy brass oiler like a weapon. A man stood in the doorway. He wore a heavy canvas coat, thick leather boots, and a beige Stetson that had seen better decades. He didn't look like a banker. He didn't look like a local. He just stood there, completely motionless, staring at the Miller Hart with an expression of stunned, silent reverence. Arthur yelled over the rhythmic explosions. "Barn's closed! Property of the bank!" The man didn't seem to hear him. He took slow, deliberate steps into the barn, his eyes tracking the brutal, mechanical poetry of the exposed governor weights spinning on the side of the block. He walked right up to the edge of the vibrating mud. Bang! The engine fired, sending a tongue of flame out the exhaust. The stranger didn't flinch. He leaned in, sniffing the air like a hound. "Ether, kerosene, and 30-weight oil," the man yelled over the noise, his voice a gravelly baritone. He looked at Arthur, a wide, genuine grin cracking his wind-chapped face. "You running a little rich on the needle valve, buddy. But by God, she breathes." Arthur lowered the oil can, his muscles coiled with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" The man reached into his coat pocket and produced a pair of thick leather gloves, pulling them on. "Name's Reed. Thomas Reed." "Mind if I cut the fuel? You're gonna crack the water jacket if she gets any hotter." Arthur hesitated. The paranoia of the past month screamed at him to throw the man out. Everyone who came down that driveway wanted something from him. But his shoulder was throbbing, and the water in the hopper was now boiling over, hissing violently as it hit the hot cylinder block. Arthur gave a stiff nod. Reed stepped past the spinning flywheel with the practiced grace of a man who still possessed all 10 fingers. He reached into the chaotic tangle of moving linkages and cleanly pinched off the brass fuel petcock. The engine coasted. The intake valve hissed, drawing in dead air. The massive wheels spun, silently carrying their momentum. It took nearly 3 full minutes for the heavy iron to bleed off its kinetic energy. When the engine finally shuddered to a halt with a heavy metallic sigh, the silence in the barn was deafening. Only the crackle of the cooling iron and the hiss of evaporating water remained. Arthur rubbed his ringing ears. "You lost, Reed?" Reed didn't answer right away. He pulled a clean white rag from his back pocket and wiped a smear of fresh grease off the brass serial plate riveted to the side of the cylinder. He traced the stamped numbers with his thumb. 1,909, Reed murmured, more to himself than to Arthur. Twin flywheel, hit and miss. 12-inch bore. My God. They scrapped 90% of these for the war effort in 42. The rest rusted out in fields. He turned to Arthur, his eyes sharp and calculating, but devoid of the predatory gleam Caldwell had possessed. "Where did you find this, Mr. Pendleton?" "Arthur Pendleton," Arthur said, leaning heavily against the workbench. "And I didn't find it. It's been sitting in that exact spot since my grandfather laid the concrete footings for it in 1934. Reed let out a low whistle. Original location. Unmolested. No weld repairs on the block. He looked around the decaying barn, his gaze lingering on the empty cattle stalls and the foreclosure notice tacked to the bulletin board. He read the room quickly and accurately. "Bank taking the place?" Reed asked. The question wasn't mean, it was just a statement of geography. Arthur's jaw tightened. 30 days. Well, 26. Now. Reed nodded slowly. He looked back at the hot, ticking iron of the Miller Hart. "Pendleton. I buy antique heavy machinery for a private museum up in Ohio. They specialize in early American industrial power." He folded his rag and tucked it away. "Your banker been out here?" "Yeah," Arthur spat, the bitter taste returning to the back of his throat. Wrote it down for scrap weight. $200, he figured. Reed let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter. It echoed in the quiet barn. "Scrap weight," he repeated, shaking his head. "God bless men in suits. They wouldn't know a gold mine if it fell on their wingtips." Arthur frowned, a tight knot forming in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" Reed walked over to Arthur. He didn't smile this time. He looked dead serious. "Arthur, there are exactly 1,909 Miller-Hart twins left in the world. One is in the Smithsonian, one is in a private collection in Germany, and one is sitting in a puddle of mud in your barn." Arthur felt the floorboards shift under his boots, or maybe it was just his knees giving out. He gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles turning white. "It's just an engine. It cuts wood." "It's history," Reed corrected gently. "It's provenance, and it runs. You proved that 10 minutes ago." Reed reached into his coat and pulled out a checkbook bound in thick saddle leather. "I don't play games, Arthur. I don't negotiate down. I know what my client has authorized me to spend to complete his collection." Reed clicked a pen. He didn't use a tablet. He used heavy, watermarked paper. $250,000, Reed said, his voice flat, cutting through the damp air like a scalpel. "Cashier's check, drawn on a national bank. I can have the funds verified in an hour. We handle all the rigging, all the transport. You don't lift another finger." Arthur stopped breathing. The number hit him like a physical blow to the chest. 250,000. The mortgage arrears were 40,000. The remaining principal was 120. The number wasn't just survival. It was freedom. It was a reset button on a life that had been grinding toward a miserable, inevitable halt. He looked at the piece of paper in Reed's hand. Then, he looked at the engine. The heat radiating from the cooling iron warmed the right side of his face. The smell of the burnt kerosene was etched into his clothes, his hair, his skin. He remembered the grueling, painful days of soaking the rusted bolts. He remembered the agony in his shoulder as he hauled on the heavy iron spokes. He had resurrected it. He had breathed fire back into its iron lungs. It wasn't scrap. It was his grandfather. It was the only thing on this farm that had fought back against the dying of the light. And now, a man he had known for 5 minutes was asking him to sell it to a stranger in Ohio. Arthur felt a sudden, violently protective urge. A cynical voice in his head screamed at him to take the money, to laugh in Caldwell's face, to save the dirt beneath his feet. But the emotional weight of the iron anchored him to the floor. It felt like a betrayal. He was selling the soul to save the body. Arthur started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard. "I brought it back." Reed's expression softened. He saw the conflict. He had seen it 100 times before in 100 failing barns across the Midwest. The deep, agonizing attachment to the tools that broke men's backs. "You did," Reed said quietly. "You saved it, Arthur. If you let the bank take this property, they'll bring an excavator in here. They'll smash the roof in. They'll sell that engine to a scrapper who will cut it into 6 pieces with an oxy-torch, just to get it on a flatbed. It will be rebar by Christmas." Reed stepped closer, holding out the checkbook. "Let me put it in a museum. Let people hear it run, and you keep the farm." Arthur looked at the rusted behemoth. The oil he had spilled on the crankcase was slowly dripping down onto the dirt floor, thick and dark, like blood. He closed his eyes. The ringing in his ears from the exhaust notes was finally fading, replaced by the hollow, whistling sound of the winter wind outside. He opened his eyes. He reached out, with his grease-stained hand. "Make it out to Arthur Pendleton," he whispered. Graham Caldwell arrived exactly on the 30th day. The snow had melted, turning the driveway into a thick, clinging soup of brown clay. Caldwell stepped out of his leased sedan, wearing tall rubber overshoes over his polished wingtips, looking deeply displeased by the physical reality of his job. He held a manila folder containing the final foreclosure documents. Behind his car, a heavy-duty tow truck from a local repossession company idled, its diesel engine clattering loudly in the crisp morning air. Caldwell walked up the steps to the farmhouse porch. He didn't knock. He just stood there, waiting for Arthur to emerge, treating the property like it already belonged to the bank. The front door opened. Arthur stepped out. He wore clean jeans and a canvas jacket that wasn't stained with hydraulic fluid. He didn't look defeated. He looked exhausted. Yes, the deep bags under his eyes were prominent, but his posture was straight. His bad shoulder was tightly wrapped beneath his shirt, a dull ache that he barely noticed anymore. "Mr. Pendleton," Caldwell said, his tone brisk and professional. "It's day 30. I have the paperwork for the transfer of the deed. I assume you've vacated the premises?" Arthur walked over to the porch railing. He leaned against it, looking past Caldwell to the idling tow truck. "You brought a repo guy for a tractor with bald tires?" "Standard procedure," Caldwell said, opening his manila folder. "Asset realization." "Right. Asset realization." Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a crisp, white envelope. He didn't hand it over with a dramatic flourish. He just held it out, his grease-stained fingers contrasting sharply with the pristine paper. "What's this?" Caldwell asked, hesitating. "That is a certified cashier's check," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "for $162,412. That covers the $40,000 in arrears, the $120 in principal, and the late fees your office tacked on last Tuesday." Caldwell stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. He didn't take it. "Mr. Pendleton, this is highly irregular. The foreclosure process has already been finalized in our system." "The law says I have 30 days to clear the debt," Arthur interrupted, his tone hardening. "It is 9 a.m. on day 30. Call your branch manager. Call your legal department. Call whoever you need to call. But take the damn check, Graham, and get off my property." Caldwell slowly reached out and took the envelope. He opened it. He stared at the watermarked check. He blinked, the sterile, unbothered mask finally slipping, revealing genuine, utter confusion. "Where? How did you secure these funds?" Arthur looked past the banker, his eyes drifting toward the barn. 2 days prior, a specialized rigging crew had arrived. They hadn't brought an excavator. They had brought a lowboy trailer, heavy timber cribbing, and a hydraulic gantry. It had taken 6 men 8 hours to slowly, carefully hoist the 4-ton Miller Hart out of the dirt. Arthur had watched the entire process from the doorway. When the engine was finally chained down to the deck of the trailer, the massive flywheels secured with heavy nylon straps, Reed had walked over. He had shaken Arthur's hand, leaving a smear of grease on Arthur's palm. "You did good, Arthur," Reed had said. Then, the diesel truck had roared to life, pulling away down the driveway. Arthur had stood in the cold, watching the heavy iron behemoth disappear over the crest of the hill. He had walked back into the barn. The space where the engine had sat for 90 years was just a rectangular depression in the dirt, surrounded by a faint, lingering smell of kerosene and old grease. It was an amputation. It saved the patient, but the phantom limb would ache forever. Arthur pulled his attention back to the banker standing on his porch. "I sold some scrap weight," Arthur said softly. Caldwell looked at the check, then up at Arthur, entirely failing to understand the joke. He cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. "I see. Well, I will. I will have to take this to the regional office to be verified. If it clears, the foreclosure will be halted." "It'll clear," Arthur said. He turned his back on Caldwell and opened the front door. "Take the repo truck with you. You're rutting up my driveway." Arthur walked into the house and shut the door. He didn't watch them leave. He went to the kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat at the table. He listened to the sound of Caldwell's sedan and the heavy tow truck backing down the driveway. Slowly, the sounds of the vehicles faded, swallowed by the vast, rolling hills. The silence returned to the farm. But it wasn't the suffocating, ringing silence of failure anymore. It was just the quiet of an empty house. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. His shoulder throbbed. His hands were still calloused and rough. He had no cattle. He had no machinery. He was a farmer with nothing to farm, sitting on a piece of dirt that finally, truly belonged to him. He set the mug down. He looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. The doors were closed. The ghost in the iron was gone, roaring on a flatbed somewhere on an interstate in Ohio. Arthur smiled, a small, sad, cynical curve of his lips. He had won. It felt exactly like a loss, but he had won. He rubbed his grease-stained thumb against his index finger. He closed his eyes, and if he concentrated hard enough, he could still feel the floorboards shaking. Thud! 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 Bang! If Arthur's grit and that roaring 1909 iron beast made you feel something real today, don't let the story stop here. Smash that like button, share this video with a friend who appreciates hard work, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded stories of forgotten history. Drop a comment below. Would you have sold the engine or fought to keep it? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.